Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. All right, thank you everybody for joining us. My name is Kristen Stratton, and I've been invited to be a guest speaker by NorCal Services for Deaf and Hard of Hearing. I'm a hard of hearing adult and the parent of 3 children with disabilities, 2 of whom who are deaf themselves. I also work as a professional special education advocate, and today I'll be presenting the 3rd out of 4 series of presentations on special education topics. And today is IEP basics for parents of deaf children ages 3 to 22. So terms to know today, we're going to be discussing IDEA, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. We will be discussing the document that creates the Individualized Education Plan, or IEP. We'll be talking about who implements the IEP. That's the local educational agency, or LEA, and how that is should be done in the least restrictive environment, or the LRE. And the goal of the IEP is to ensure a student's right to a free and appropriate public education, or what's commonly known as a FAPE, F-A-P-E. And our primary discussion will be on the Deaf Plus population, which is deaf, hard of hearing, or deafblind individuals who may have or who are known to have developmental delays or disabilities. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so what is an IEP? We have the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which makes available a free and appropriate public education, or FAPE, to eligible students with disabilities. In our previous presentation, we talked about assessments and how a student is determined to become eligible for an IEP. An IEP is intended to protect the rights of eligible children with disabilities and also their parents. It's a legal document. It is enforceable, and it is intended to be able to explain to whatever school is required to implement that document what that child's needs are. When that document is not being implemented, there is a complaint process. You can either file a complaint with the Department of Education in your respective state, or you can file for due process with the State Office of Administrative Hearing. That IEP document specifies the special education and related services that are required to prepare that child for further education, employment, and independent living. So the intention of IDEA, or the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, is not just to get a child through K through 12 education. The goal is to prepare them for their life beyond school. This is an example of the front page of an IEP document. Now, in the state of California, there are many different formats for IEPs that different school districts or county offices of education might adopt to organize their IEPs. So your particular school district might use a different software and it might look a little different, but the content of an IEP is always very consistent. So an IEP is always going to identify your child by name. It's always going to say when they were originally, just want to make sure we didn't lose our interpreter. Okay, thank you. is always going to identify how your child qualified for an IEP, under what disability category, when they qualified. And we always have IEP meetings at least once a year. And we always assess children at least every 3 years. And those dates are always going to be detailed on the IEP document. And so that's one of the ways that we are consistent. So regardless of what your child's IEP document might look like, it might vary from this one, that information is always going to be embedded in that IEP. So an IEP document really should build itself. The components of the IEP are very consistent. When we talk about building an IEP, we're always going to start with, where is a child functioning right now? That's the child's present levels. If we always start there, we're always going to naturally be identifying what the child's areas of needs are. Where does that child need help? And we're not just talking about grades. We're supposed to be looking at the whole child. So from the moment that child steps on campus, every aspect of their day should be considered. And once we've identified the areas in which that child needs help, then the team's job is to propose goals to support those areas of need. And then based on those goals, the team is going to propose services that are required for that child to make progress on those goals. And they're also going to consider which accommodations and other supports might need to be put in place in the child's environment to make it accessible. But those services are going to be necessary to make progress on those goals. And the team is then going to say, okay, based on the goals, based on the services, what environment do we need to implement this IEP? And that's the placement. And then we take that entire package of goals, services, accommodations, and placement, and that becomes the child's offer of FAPE, the free and appropriate public education. So most districts' continuum of placement options will look something like this. Placement is, where does the child's offer of FAPE take place? Where does the child spend their day? So most districts consider general education to be the child's least restrictive environment. That means a general education student who has no accommodations, no supports, no services would be considered to be in the least restrictive placement. As we start to add more supports, more services, more time outside of the classroom, then we're going to be talking about a child being in a more restrictive placement. So within the general education classroom, we can add accommodations, we can add some related services that might remove the student from the classroom but are not necessarily special education. So that would be speech services, occupational therapy, but are not necessarily special education teacher services. And then once we start adding in special education, then we would consider the placement to become more restrictive. Once we start adding special education, then we're adding a service that's called SAI, or Specialized Academic Instruction. That can take place in a couple of ways within general education. It can take place within the general education classroom, and that's frequently called a push-in service. Or that can take place outside of the general education classroom, and that's frequently called a pull-out service. Then we start talking about supporting the student in a separate setting classroom, where the teacher in the classroom is no longer a general education teacher, but a special education credentialed teacher. And that child is spending the majority of their day outside of the general education classroom. Once that happens and a child is maybe no longer able to maintain the standards that are set by the state for their grade level, the next step on that continuum might be to discuss whether or not they need to maintain placement in what's called a mild moderate setting, where they're still working on grade level standards, or moving to an alternative curriculum placement where they're going to be working on functional life skills and will no longer be working on state standards. In most districts, going to a state school for the deaf will be considered to be more restrictive than being in a hearing mainstream school, because as the law is written, it defines being with non-disabled peers as less restrictive than being with same age typical peers. Now, within deaf education, we know that being with peers that you can communicate directly with and teachers and staff that you can communicate directly with to be much less restrictive, but that's not how it's defined within the law. Non-public schools would typically be for kids who cannot make progress in their environment in a public school setting. A lot of my clients who are placed in a non-public school require a substantial emotional or behavioral support. And then home hospital placement is usually meant to be a temporary placement, but sometimes for medically fragile or medically complex children, that is a less restrictive placement. So placement questions to consider: how is a child functioning in their current environment? What are the family and student goals? Is general education always the least restrictive environment for all students? Do all alternative curriculum students have to be in self-contained classrooms? And what does language access look like for your student in each setting that's being considered? These are things to keep in mind when you're going through the IEP development process. Okay, so back to present levels. We should be considering the whole child. We're looking at how does a child learn? We're going to start with the student's strengths and preferences. What do they like and how do they like to do it? Parent input is also critically important. This is where the parent is going to talk about their concerns for their child and their preferences for their child. In the present levels part of the IEP, we're also going to put any sort of data that we have. Maybe we have test scores. Maybe we have input from teachers about academic scores in reading, writing, and math. Any fine or gross motor skills that we can report on. Communication development is also going to be reported on here, as well as social, emotional, and behavioral needs. Health information and vocational information. That's the skills of being a student. And then adaptive and daily living skills. So here you see we consider the whole child. These are all the areas of need that we consider. And when I look at present levels as an advocate, what I don't like to see is just raw data. I want to see observational input, and I want to see what does it look like for a child to be in a classroom. This is just an example of what a present levels form might look like. Again, you'll see all those areas that we just discussed. The whole child should be considered. But again, the format might vary depending on your school district. So we've considered present levels. Based on those present levels, the IEP team will identify areas of need that the child requires support. And from that, we're going to say where we need to develop IEP goals. Goals are how IEP teams measure progress. Our present level is our baseline. That's where we're starting. We're identifying where we need to establish the child is at and where we want that child to be in 1 year's time. That's our goal target. Sometimes we're going to write short-term objectives. Those are going to be short-term intervals of time where we're going to check in and make sure that child is on track to meet that goal within 1 year. If a child is in an alternative curriculum program, those short-term objectives are required to be in the IEP goal. As a parent, I would be asking my IEP team WH questions about my IEP goals. Who is supporting my child with this goal? What are we measuring? When is my child working on this goal? Where is my child going to work on this goal? Why are we working on this goal? Sometimes goals are written for no reason at all. And how are we measuring progress? Especially if you're new to the IEP process, it's really important to understand why goals are being proposed, because goals drive your child's placement and services. Goals are critical to the IEP development process. And if you don't understand why a goal is being written for your child, you're not going to understand or be able to participate in the services and the placement discussion. This is an example of what a goal might look like in an IEP document. Again, the format might vary in your district, but the components will always be the same. The area of need will be specified, and I'll get into that in our next slide. The baseline, where the child is currently at, and then we will specifically state where we want the child to be in 1 year's time, and who is going to be responsible for helping the child make progress on that goal. All of that is going to be specified in each IEP goal that we develop. Okay, so here's an example. And in true transparency, William is my child. So this comes straight from his kindergarten IEP, I believe. So our baseline is, again, our present level, where the child is functioning. So at this time, William is receptively, meaning with his eyeballs, how he understands language, identifying 16 out of 26 of the letters in ASL. That means when someone is signing letters to him, he's understanding 16 out of 26 of them. He struggles to understand P, Q, M, N, T, S, A, X, K, and E. So when an ASL letter is signed to him, he can when an ASL letter is signed to him, William can receptively identify the correct letter by selecting the corresponding ASL letter in print form from a field of 3 with 60% accuracy across 5 trials. Okay, that's a lot. If you've never read a goal, seen a goal, that might be a lot of gibberish to you. So let me walk it back very quickly. So what we're asking for our baseline is to tell us 2 things. It's asking us to tell us what the skill is and how we're measuring it based on where the student is at presently. And so for right now, the skill is receptive identification of an ASL letter and matching that to a printed ASL card. And I'm measuring it by trialing that student. I'm asking them to do it 5 times, and I'm saying, okay, 3 out of 5 times, I'm getting 60% accuracy. It's still okay if that's a little confusing, but this is the language that you're going to see in ASL goals, in math goals, in speech goals, or at least you ought to. If your baseline or your present level does not have anything measurable in it, that's a problem. So for our annual goal, we're going to say by November 16th, after being shown an ASL letter signed to him, William will demonstrate knowledge of all 26 letters receptively by receptively identifying the correct corresponding letter from a field of 3 with 100% accuracy across 5 trials. So there's 2 things I want to point out here. We're doing the same skill, which is receptive identification of an ASL letter and matching it to a corresponding ASL card. We're asking for the same number of trials, and we're still measuring in a percentage. So everything that we're trying to measure matches and the skill matches. That is what an optimal ASL or any sort of IEP goal should look like. Your skill should match and your measurement should match. And if they don't, the IEP goal needs to be revised. We are, again, teaching an IEP goals specific class on November 30th, and we deep dive heavily into how we build goals because it's a lot of information. So I highly encourage you to attend. Okay, so district and statewide testing. If you're a young new parent attending this presentation, you don't really have to worry about any of this until 3rd grade. But all you need to know right now is that we have district and statewide testing and that your child with disabilities can receive accommodations for those assessments. And a lot of those tests are standardized. A lot of them are computer-based now. And a lot of those assessments that we would ordinarily have requested back in the day are already embedded for our students with deafness and hearing loss. But if your child is also going to go on and maybe take some college admissions tests, it's highly important that when your child is older, that whatever accommodations are required for those admissions tests be documented in the IEP, and that you make sure that their high school counselors submit in advance that request for accommodation. You don't just show up to the SAT with a copy of your IEP and say, these are the accommodations I get, because you won't get them. So in the IEP as well, if a student is an English language learner, if they have any physical disability that requires accommodation for the physical fitness test, all of that will be detailed here. If your child does have a physical disability, California is very, very strict on requiring physical fitness tests, even for the most impacted children. I have clients who are in wheelchairs who are still not exempt from any level of participation in PE tests, even with doctor's notes. So just know that that's something that if your child requires accommodation, you need documentation from your physician as to what they can and cannot participate in. So special factors is a very important part of the IEP for deaf and hard of hearing students. This is where we document special considerations that must be made by the IEP team for students with low incidence disabilities. But this is also if a student has any behavioral needs, this is where we would also document what we would need to do to support those needs as well. So special factors, does behavior impede the student's ability to learn or the ability of others to learn? And if so, do we need to write a behavior support plan, put positive behavior interventions in place? For students who are not native English speakers, we would document any supports or services that are required to support that student. For blind or visually impaired students, again, that's the language that's utilized in the IEP. We would document if they need instruction in Braille, any accommodations or low incidence equipment. We would put that in special factors. For deaf and hard of hearing students, we would document any specialized equipment if they're using an FM system, their communication needs, their access to direct instruction in their native language, their access to peers. All of that should be considered as part of the special factors page. And any assistive technology needs are also documented here. And that would include the needs of students with orthopedic impairments, if they need communication devices, if they need any adaptive equipment like wheelchairs, gait trainers, all of that would be documented in special factors. And low incidence funding is available to students with low vision, deaf or hard of hearing, and orthopedic impairment like cerebral palsy. This is an example of the special factors page. This is where we would document all of those needs. Now, some of that information is also going to be included later on in the IEP document in accommodations, but sometimes it's good to be redundant, especially when we're talking about specialized equipment and services specific to low incidence disabilities. So I always like to ensure that we're being highly specific when we're talking about low incidence services and equipment needs. And there's only so many characters that you can write in some of these documents. So it's okay to be redundant and put things in numerous times, especially when it's critically important for that child's ability to access their environment and access their language. So supplemental aids and services, program accommodations, modifications, and supports. This is a very, very important part of the IEP. So 2 things I want to say before we go through the list. Accommodations and modifications are 2 different words. They are used interchangeably, but they do not mean the same thing. Accommodations are accommodations change how we learn. Modifications change what we learn. So I want to just make that differentiation right off the bat. So supplemental aids and accommodations are how a student accesses information. So when we're making accommodations for a student, we're going to write things into the IEP if they need additional time on a test, for example, if they need seating accommodations. If a student is utilizing hearing assistive technology and they need listening breaks, repeating and restating questions, referencing a student by name to help locate a speaker, things like that. Services in this portion of the IEP are not direct services to the student. They typically refer to consultative services that are to support staff or parents on behalf of the student. So this might be the deaf and hard of hearing teacher consulting with any of the other teachers that are instructing the students so they know how to appropriately support that student and implement all of their accommodations. Or if that student has a behavior plan, it might be a behavior specialist coming in and explaining how to implement behavior strategies. Any example like that. Modifications would include things like reducing workload or reducing the number of problems on the assignment, or even if a student is in a general education setting but is not working at general education standards, and we're highly modifying their work because that student is being included in that environment but is not working on those standards. That would be an example of modification. Oh, next slide, please. Oh, never mind. I see that you changed it. Okay, so this is an example of a supplementary aids and services page. Again, the format might look different in your district, but the content is going to be the same. So here we see a list of accommodations. What is always going to be included is a description of the accommodation or the service or the modification, who it is meant to support, the start and end date, how often that is meant to take place, the duration that support is meant to take place, and where. So for example, in this slide you have in front of you, the first example mentions attention gaining methods. And that includes tapping the student on the shoulder, tapping their desk, flickering lights on and off. These are all common attention gaining methods for students who are deaf and hard of hearing. And the support is for both student and personnel. And the start and end date is for the duration of the entire student's annual IEP. It's 5 days a week. It's for the entire time the student is receiving direct instruction, and the location is in the regular classroom because this specific student is a hard of hearing student in a general education setting. The next slide, please. This is the same page, but for a different student. This student is a signing student, and the top accommodation is for a book stand to be provided to William. This is for my son, so that he can sign books hands-free. So if you think about it, a student who's signing wouldn't be holding their book. They would need something to support the book so that they can sign the book. So that would be an example of an accommodation to support that student. And again, you see that there's, it specifies who that support is benefiting. The duration is for the length of the annual IEP, up to 10 times a day. Sometimes we're just guessing. They're not going to say, oh, you've read 10 times a day, William, and then take the stand away. When we're writing supplemental aids, that's always a minimum. And then up to 15 minutes. Again, they're not going to say your 15 minutes is up and then take away the accommodation. These are always a floor estimation. And then if the student needs more support, then they're going to, continue to provide that support. Okay, related service. What is a related service? It's a supportive service that's required to assist that child with a disability to benefit from their special education. So again, we talked about those IEP goals, what's required to make progress on those IEP goals. And generally speaking, that's going to be a related services provider. That's someone who's an expert in that specific area of need, whether that's a speech provider, an occupational therapist, a special education teacher, or a behavior therapist. It's someone who's going to be qualified to support that student in that area of need. Related services do include transportation. A lot of times I will hear people say that they were denied transportation because their child is attending the school closest to home. Related services are always an IEP team decision. It is not anywhere in the law that it says if a child is going to school too close to home, that's it. They don't qualify for transportation. It does say in the law that related services are at the discretion of the IEP team. So if it's required for the student to get transportation in order for them to benefit from their IEP, then that's what's going to be added to the IEP, regardless of how close or far their school is from their home. Related services did not include anything related to cochlear implant mapping. So the law does explicitly state that that's not covered as a related service. So when we're talking about how to offer related services, one of the things we ask is how often does that child need to receive that service? When we talk about those goals, we're going to ask questions like, what's the discrepancy between where that child is currently and where do we want them to be in 1 year's time? How often do they need support from that service provider to reach that goal target? That's why we ask those WH questions, so that we are making sure that when we get to that services conversation, we know that we're making an appropriate recommendation for the right amount of services. How many goals does that student have in that particular area? Do they have 10 academic goals? Do they have 5 speech and language goals? Do they have 8 goals that the deaf and hard of hearing teacher is going to be working on? If that student has a lot of goals and is only getting a very minimal offer for that service and that service provider, then they're probably not going to meet those IEP goals in 1 year's time. And vice versa. Sometimes we're pulling kids out of their environment too much. They have only a few goals and the service is more than they need, and they're going to miss a lot of instruction in their classroom because they're getting pulled out a lot. And maybe that provider should be pushing into their classroom instead. Those are all things that we need to consider. This is an example of a related services page. These are pretty consistent with most of the software that you might see among the state. One of the things I'll say about related services is the offer for a related service needs to be highly specific. What I see often as an advocate is I will see in the comment section, especially for specialized academic instruction minutes, that's time with a special education teacher, that it's going to be a combination of push-in minutes and pull-out minutes, but it doesn't specify how many minutes that teacher is going to be going into the classroom to visit that student and how many minutes that teacher is going to be pulling that student out of the classroom. And that is not an offer of FAPE. We need to be able to always know exactly how many minutes that student is going to be in and out of their classroom environment. So IEP offers always have to be specific. So if you can see in the example I've provided, there is a box of several related services. The first of which is for specialized deaf and hard of hearing services. This was for a student who's in a mainstream or hearing program and is receiving itinerant services, meaning that that deaf and hard of hearing teacher rotates from site to site. And this specifies the service provider, so the specialized deaf and hard of hearing services, the frequency of the service, the duration of each time that teacher visits. So it's going to be a 20-minute visit, 12 times a year, totaling 240 minutes a year. And it'll specify whether that's an individual service or a group service. And there will be a start and end date. So for this situation, this is going to take place over the course of the entire annual IEP. Sometimes we will add services mid-year because we decide a child needs something. So the start and end dates will be a little different. So, these are things that you're going to see as you're going through the IEP development process. But again, all of this needs to be specified. It has to be a highly specific offer, or you as a parent cannot agree to it, because one of the most important parts about being an IEP parent is that you have to have the opportunity for informed consent. So common related services within the deaf and hard of hearing community include interpreter services, specialized deaf and hard of hearing services that can take place in any deaf and hard of hearing program, a state school for the deaf, or in a mainstream hearing program. Audiological services. Intensive individual services is a one-on-one aid. Speech and language, which depending on which program you're in, can be working on spoken language, but can also be working on a child that's signing, or maybe they're working on being bilingual. It just depends on that child's placement. Occupational therapy, and an occupational therapist can help work on fine motor skill development to work on sign language proficiency. Adaptive physical education is a PE teacher that's helping a child who has some physical disability and is unable to participate in general education PE without some assistance. Specialized academic instruction is special education teachers providing academic instruction. and behavior intervention services. So placement for deaf students and the least restrictive environment. So when we first talked about placement, I mentioned that one of the things you need to consider are the language needs for your deaf child and what placement means for them. So the least restrictive environment in our community, we often refer to as by a different acronym. We call it the language-rich environment. So we want to consider what opportunities are there for direct instruction in American Sign Language, if that's your child's language. Learning through an interpreter is not direct instruction. So a student who is using listening and spoken language and learning from someone who is speaking in English is receiving direct instruction. A student who is in a hearing school learning through a sign language interpreter is receiving interpreted instruction. So those are things to consider when you're talking about what your child's placement should be and what their least restrictive environment is. And whether or not they have access to deaf and hard of hearing peers, or what we talk about is referred to as critical mass, meaning what is the population at your child's school site? How many students are there that are like them who are also deaf or hard of hearing? Here in California, we have adopted a Deaf Bill of Rights, which are not necessarily law that the state has said that schools must follow these specific rights, but they're more cultural adaptations that the state has said they respect and honor, and that schools must consider. And so I like to introduce the Deaf Bill of Rights to schools when I'm working as an advocate for deaf and hard of hearing kids, because a lot of school districts don't even realize that that's been adopted as part of the educational code. One of the challenges in our very, very large state is that we have very rural areas in some parts of California. And in a lot of areas, there's a huge issue with access to qualified interpreters. There is a shortage of teachers of the deaf. Many programs for deaf of hard of hearing students within counties or school districts are either very, very small or have even closed. We do have state schools for the deaf, but again, they have residential options, but these are all things that parents have to really consider when they're thinking about what's most appropriate for their child. I know in our situation, we have a child who is deaf and has multiple disabilities, who was at a state school for the deaf, but due to medical reasons had to move back to a local school and is receiving instruction through an interpreter. And that was a very difficult decision. So, you have to weigh the whole child. Again, it's not just about one need of the child. We always have to consider the whole child when we're talking about placement and when we're making that offer of FAPE. Oh, next slide, please. Okay, perfect. Speaking of offer of FAPE, and speaking of Mr. William, who's pictured right here, he's actually at CSDR in this picture. So FAPE is an individualized education program. It should meet your child's unique needs. And FAPE can only happen if your child is receiving an educational benefit. The purpose of IDEA is to prepare students for further education, employment, and independent living. And that is for all students of all needs. It's not just for students in general education. We're talking about students from general education all the way to students who are receiving alternative and life skills instruction. All of those students should be receiving the maximum educational benefit that their IEP can offer them. And so we need to consider what educational setting that is most appropriate And when we make an offer of FAPE, we're looking at what percentage of time that child is spending in and out of their general education environment. And that is including access to peers. And we quantify that by a percentage, and that becomes part of that child's offer of FAPE. And I say peers in quotations here because for a deaf and hard of hearing student, peers can mean a very different thing. And we're always trying to think through that deaf and hard of hearing lens when we're thinking about peers, because we always want to remember the importance of deaf and hard of hearing students having access to students like them who are language peers. So transition services, again, if you're a new parent to this process, you're not going to have this conversation until your child is 16. But the year your child turns 16, they're going to have a transition plan developed for them. And the purpose, again, is to develop a plan for your child so that they're prepared for life beyond high school, life beyond their adult transition program if they're going to remain on an IEP past high school. We're supposed to be preparing students for life as adults. So part of that IEP document at that age is to develop a transition plan, which includes goals. And one of the things as a deaf and hard of hearing advocate, I always want to include is for advocacy goals. And if a student's going to get out and go get a job, one of the things they should always know how to advocate for is for ADA, for Americans with Disabilities Act, accommodations at their workplace. And that can be for them to have amplified headset if they're going to be working at a job where they're going to be doing phone work, or if they need an accessible entrance at their workplace. That's something that I think is not done enough on these transition plans. So just put that in the back of your mind when your child's getting close to this age, and just really think about when you're getting close to graduation, you should be in contact with the Department of Rehabilitation. You can start receiving DOR services at age 16, and they are critically important to your child's post high school and graduation success and employment. So graduation requirements will also be discussed when your child gets a little older as part of the IEP process. There are two tracks that are primarily discussed in the IEP, and that's whether or not your child's going to receive a high school diploma or they're going to get a certificate of completion. If your child is in general education, or even if they're in special education and they're still following state standards with supports and some modifications, they're going to be on track to receive a high school diploma as long as they pass Algebra 1 and they complete all of the required credits from the state of California. In our state, you must pass Algebra 1 to receive a high school diploma. If a student is in alternative curriculum setting, or the IEP team determines that it's best that they complete a certificate of completion, then they become eligible to remain on an IEP until the age of 22. And then they can also participate in a post-high school program called an adult transition program. And that usually will focus on job skills and life skills necessary for post-ATP or adult transition program living and employment. So new to the IEP is the emergency conditions plan. This is unique to California, although other states may have also adopted this. This is so that if there's another shutdown for some reason, natural disaster, or God forbid, another pandemic, we will specify how the IEP will be implemented in the event of that emergency. And then lastly, participation and consent. Our state requires parents to consent to an IEP in order to implement it or to make changes to it. That's not true of all states. Some states, they can make changes to the offer of FAPE without parental consent, including changes of placement. Here in California, that's not the case. So when you have developed the entire IEP document, you're going to get a copy of it in its totality. You're not going to sign anything at the meeting. They might ask you to. All you have to really sign at the meeting is that you participated. So you can say, okay, I'll sign. I was here. I participated. But you do not have to sign consent to the document. And really, you should not until you have seen the whole thing. You've had a chance to take it home, reread it, digest it all, ask questions. And quite honestly, usually there's things that need to be revised, or you might reread through something in present levels and go, oh, that's not quite what I said, or I don't understand what this means. And you kind of want to ask a question or get some clarification, maybe revise some of the goals, because as we spoke before, maybe there wasn't a percentage in one of the baselines, and you want to make sure that that child's IEP goal is really going to be measurable. There are things that sometimes after the meetings we go back and forth on a little bit. So you really should not be signing consent at the meeting. So it's okay to sign as a meeting participant. So that's fine, but I would highly, highly encourage you to wait until you get the entire IEP document in your hands and have a chance to read it over and digest it before you sign consent. So here in California, we sign a couple ways. You're going to initial whether or not you received a copy of what's called your procedural safeguards. We're going to do a presentation upload to the website on that. We had a little technical difficulty on our procedural safeguards presentation earlier this month. So we didn't get a chance to go really in depth on the entire presentation, but that will be made available on NorCal's website probably sometime in December. But your procedural safeguards are all of your parental rights. You'll sign that you got a copy of those. You're required to get those at least once a year. And then your signature for consent includes a couple of options. You can agree to all parts, saying, hey, I read every part of this IEP document. Great, I understand it. I agree to all of it. I think it all supports my child appropriately. Yes, this definitely going to provide my child with a free and appropriate public education. Or maybe you read it and you say, okay, well, there are parts of it that I don't agree with, but I don't want my child to not start some of these services. So I will agree to it with the exception of ... And I will provide a written statement with the things that I do not agree with, but I will provide consent so that what is being offered can be initiated. But then that also gives me the opportunity to document the things that I still think are insufficient, are not appropriately documented. Maybe someone said something in the notes that are not what I said, so I disagree with that. Maybe I asked for more services than what they offered, and I disagree with the service offer. Those are all examples of what you might sign with exception to. But you're always going to do that in writing. It's very rare that a parent's going to sign do not agree with the entire document. And if you're feeling like that's what you ever need to sign, I really would advise that you talk to an advocate first, because that's usually got some implications. Maybe you might even be going through due process at that point. So I would say if you're going to sign do not agree with the entire document, you should probably at least talk to an advocate before you sign that way. In California, the IEP will also maybe ask for your consent for Medi-Cal reimbursement. That means the school wants to seek reimbursement for related services through the state, through Medi-Cal. That's optional. And I would encourage you to look that up online because there might be some implications as to your child's ability to receive services through Medi-Cal if there's any lifetime caps on some of those services, if you have a child that's particularly medically complex. So just look that up and see if that's an appropriate thing for you to sign or not. But remember, lastly, this is a legal document. So when in doubt, wait to sign and get some more information. And then the last thing I also want to mention is if you are not a native English speaker, or if reading in English is not your preferred language to read in, you can have it transliterated into ASL or into another language, Spanish, Mandarin. I won't say that districts do that very quickly, but by law, they are supposed to. And if you have any difficulty in having that done, please contact NorCal or another advocacy agency, maybe disability rights. It really just depends on the language and what difficulty you're having. But that is a right that you have, is to have all documents translated into your native language so that you can participate in the IEP process. So I will take any questions if anybody has any. If you do not, thank you so much for the opportunity to present today. Again, we have our IEP goals training on the 30th of this month. It'll be the same time, 10 to 11. And we also will be putting up a QR code. If you would like to provide us with some feedback about today's presentation, we would really appreciate it. And if you would like to ask a question, you can utilize the chat box and I will take your questions.